Hello everyone. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over the timeline features in Animate CC. Yay, finally, the timeline. The most important thing for creating animations, because animation is the art of images that change over time, right? Okay, so let's just drag this bad boy here. Um, so make sure that you choose like the right view for your timeline. The standard view is like this. If you have used Animate before, you can just stick to that. I'm going to use the timeline with the preview option. I think it's best for kind of teaching the features of Animate. Later on, we can switch to the other version. I'm going to close or actually collapse this tab just to give myself more area to work with. Okay, so this is the timeline. Voila. Um, if you have worked in any drawing applications before, so you can get a sense of this timeline. The first thing that you notice is that you can have multiple layers. So it means, for example, if I want to work on an animation, I can have a background layer, or I can have multiple layers for different objects that move. And you know what? Let me just get to the view that you're seeing by clicking that. That's probably what you would see as you open up Animate. It probably has like one layer with just one frame on it. So what I can do is that let's start by putting something in this layer. We have done this before, but now let's just create like a background. What do you think about that? I'm just gonna draw a shape, rectangle. Let's just go to my panel. I don't want to have any strokes, so that's fine. But the fill color is just something almost interesting. Let's just create like the yellow sky. Let's just be bold. And I can drag outside of my screen area. Um, and what else? I also would like to create something that I can think of as yeah, let's switch to brush. I want to also create something like a grass or something, just like that. So I'm gonna do, I need to close this shape so I can fill it with color. Voila, done. So this is my background, and I know that when I render this scene, I'm gonna only be seeing this, okay? This is my background, awesome. So now I need to create another layer on top of that to create my animation because I don't want to redraw background all the time, right? So I'm going to create another layer just like that. And I'm going to choose brush color. What complements those colors? What do you folks think? Can't hear you. That's a shame. Let's just go with orange. Just gonna change the size of the brush, make it bigger. And you know what? Let's just start with numbers. Oops, it's too hard to read. Let's just go dark. Red. Okay, awesome. That's perfect. Okay, now I just created two layers. Voila, nice. So as we talked about this, animation is the art of images that change over time. So let's just change the time. Let's go from frame 1 to frame 2. Oops, it doesn't let me. Why? You know what? Because there's nothing in here. We first need to create the frame so that Animate can scroll through it. So because we created a 24 frame per second document, you can see that at frame 24, I see this 1 second mark. Also, I think it is helpful that Animate kind of highlights the frames every 5 frames or so. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, but 24 is our mark. And this is going to be like 1 second. So for example, let's say I want to see this background image for 1 second. I need to fill the space with that image, right? There are multiple ways to do that. And here is when the Animate shortcuts come in handy. I need to add frames to this keyframe that I have here. So I'm just going to click here on frame 1, and I'm going to right click and say insert frame, right? Insert frame, and it does that. So now if I scroll over time, I can see that my background is there and it's being held for 1 second. I have this one number that appears only for one frame and then disappears because nothing is there, right? So what did I just do? Let's take a closer look at the frame structure in Animate. So I'm just going to create a new file. Let's just hide this one. Hide it for now. And so in Animate, as you can see here, when you create a frame, you're actually drawing in the head of the frame, right? And if you turn on the preview, you see like a preview in here. And as you add frame, it holds that frame for how much time that you specify you want to hold that frame. So this is like the same thing, but it's being held for longer, right? So this part that you draw on, Animate calls it keyframe. And this part that is just kind of, you can think of as just giving this frame, keyframe, more space time, right? This part, Animate calls it frame. And if you ask me, I think it's a very confusing way of naming things. First thing, I don't like that applications use the phrase keyframe for calling those things because keyframe, it has a definition in animation and it's different than just like you can call every frame keyframe. It's not correct. But we can live with that. That's fine as long as we know what it means within the content of this application. And then frames, these are like, you can call them exposure, not the exposure meaning the lighting. It means that you get, you're giving it more screen time, right? It means that it's being held longer on the screen. Instead of just one frame, now it's being held for 24 frames, right? But I didn't draw on the other frames. All right, so let's just hide this one, go back to our one frame. So now let's see, I want to show you some numbers and I want these numbers to change over time. So I need to go to the next frame and then start drawing. So if I start drawing and I attempt to draw, let's see in here, and you need to select layer. This is really important. If you want to stop yourself from drawing on any layer, and I can just do Control Shift A to deselect everything, you can just lock that layer, right? So now this layer is locked. It means that I cannot draw on top of that. It says it's locked. Would you like to unlock? Nope. All right, going back to our numbers frame. Now I want to start drawing. Again, it doesn't let me do that. Why? Because there's nothing there. I first need to create an empty keyframe for to be able to draw on that. So I can click here, right click, and then convert to blank keyframe. Now there's like a empty keyframe in here that I can start drawing on, and I'm just gonna draw number 2. Beautiful, isn't it? So now I have 2 frames. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And if I play it, that's how it goes. 1, 2, really fast, and then it goes toward the end. As you start working with the timeline in Animate, remember that you should not trust the play preview that you get within the application. Why? Because it only plays it as fast as it can based on the um, specifications of the system that you're working on. It means that if it cannot handle playing all the frames, it's just going to play it slow, right? So to see the actual timing, it's best that you just do a control test. It just tests the scene. It's not the best way to export your scene, but just to see how the timing works. And I specifically wanted to show you this, that if you hide a layer in Animate, it doesn't mean that it doesn't get exported. Weird, right? It's like, nope, I need another thing to make sure that you really don't want to export it. We can be like, okay, so let's just go back and fix it. To hide this layer, you just click on this and then it doesn't show up in the preview. But to actually not export it, you need to right click and set it to a guide, right? And then this icon appear here that is specified that it's a guide. You can uncheck that and export it whenever you want. Now let's do control test. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. You can see that it's really fast. So remember that the length of this video is just 1 second and then it's being replayed. How do we know? Because it was 24 frames. We saw the mark of 1 second. And that one frame for each of these numbers, it just gives us something that happens super fast, right? Okay. But now we know how to create images. Let's just continue doing that just to get a sense of how that's done. You can come to an empty spot, right click, and convert to keyframe. Now we have a spot that we can draw on. Just gonna draw 3, another number, beautiful, right? Um, This is not the best way to add keyframes because it is time consuming doing that through right clicking keyframe. This is when the function keys are going to come in use. So now we can use the shortcut for that. If I right click, you can see that whenever I click on convert to blank keyframe, I also can see the shortcut for that, which is F7. So if you're for Mac users, people that are working on a Mac machine, you should have done the changing the function keys so that they don't work with Fn key. So now you should be good to go to just hit F7, right? And now I get the same thing, an empty keyframe that I can draw on. Then I can put down 4, right? And if I want to create an empty keyframe next to that, I can just hit F7 again, and then it goes to the next frame and creates that empty spot for me. And then I can continue that, right? F7, 6, F7, 7. You get the idea, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7. And if we take a look at our time, these numbers, they are still not even up to half of a second, right? So just keep that in mind. If I play it down here, like, whoo, goes by super fast. Can't even read that, right? Okay, but now we know how to create keyframes. So let's go back to our kind of way of seeing how Animate thinks about keyframes and frames. So what is this frame thing? So we use that to give our background more space, more screen time. We can also do the same to be able to actually read those numbers when we export our files, right? So let's just Command Control Shift A, deselect everything. If I get a test, Control test, what did you force? It's not even readable, right? It's like, ooh, super fast. And you see these white areas. This is because I'm not exporting it, and I just use the control test. It just captures almost everything that is within the scene. Don't worry about it. All right, so maybe if let's just try something really quick. If I clip the content, is it going to respect that? No, it doesn't, as I expected. All right, so now let's just add some um, exposure or screen time, or as Animate calls them, frames, to each of these numbers so we can actually read them. Let's just give them more screen time. So in order to do that, you can go to each of those keyframes, right click, and then do insert frame. And now you can see that this gray area appears next to that. Now it's kind of like a cell that has 2 frames. The first one being your keyframe, next one the frame, as Animate call it, or the way that I want to call it, this is the frame and this is the exposure of that frame. So you have one frame, but you expose it to the screen for 2 frames. Hope that makes sense. So now I get more screen time for this number 1. I can do the same to this frame as well and do insert frame, add frames to this. I can also use the keyboard shortcut for going to the next keyframe. Oops, not that. Remember that it's Alt and dot. Yes, okay, so Alt and dot, dot and column. So dot and column is you can use them to go frame by frame, forward, backward, backward. You can also use those here, but this is not the best way of doing that. Keyboard shortcuts are our friends. But if you're on a frame and you want to go to the next keyframe, you can hold down Alt and then dot, right? And then it takes you to the head of that cell, which is, as Animate CC calls it, the keyframe, right? So I can go to the next keyframe, right click, insert frame, but take a look, it has a shortcut, so why not using that? So I can just hit F5 on the keyboard instead of doing that. Isn't it nice? So Control Shift A to deselect everything, Alt dot to go to the next keyframe, F5 to add more exposure. Let's do it again. Alt dot, next keyframe, F5, add exposure. Alt dot, next keyframe, F5 to add exposure. Beautiful. Okay. So now that we can see that we're counting these numbers up until a little bit more than half of a second. Let's just save this scene. I just get paranoid and I was like, ooh, it can crash at any moment. I'm just going to call this one 2007. Today is the 7th of the July. I'm going to call this timeline practice. What? Let's just use camel casing. Practice. This is easier to read. And save. Okay, so now let's do control test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Almost there. It's still not readable, but it definitely, those numbers are showing up for longer on the screen. There are actually not very good ways to add frames to all of them at once. For example, if I want to hold all of these frames instead of 2 frames, I want to hold them for 3 frames. The only way to do it decently in Animate CC the way that it is right now is to hold down Shift and select everything. Oops. Hold down Shift, select it. Oh, no. Come on, let's do it again. Be nice. So nothing is selected. Hold down Shift, then click drag. Okay, there we go. Okay. You see that yellow thing appears here? If I drag it exactly twice as the number of the frames, which is now like I have 14 frames, right? So if I drag it to exactly 28, then it's gonna do a nice job and hold these for each of them for now 4 frames, right? So it distributes them nice and even. But here's the trick. If I do it like this without counting, then it just does something. It just guesses like, oh, I'm just gonna put 2 frames in here and then 3 over there. So there's not a much decent way of doubling the frames or exposure or screen time for these frames all at once. But what you can do is that you can do it with the keyboard shortcuts, Alt, next keyframe, add exposure, Alt, keyframe, exposure, right? There's that. I can just do it really quick. So now you can see that we're seeing them for longer. Let's give it a test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, almost readable. It's still less than a second. Why? Because you still get to see the empty background, and we know that our background is being held for 1 second. All right. So now hopefully you get a sense of what is this keyframe and what is this frame. So frames are actually for giving yourself more screen time, right? So I'm going to end the video here, and in the next video I'm going to show you how you can copy, paste, move over, and play around a little bit more in the timeline. So stay tuned.